What does a bomber crew do when their plane is crippled, their landing gear is gone, and the only way home is to crash land a 10-ton aircraft on its bare belly? This is not a hypothetical scenario. This is the desperate reality faced by 9 men over the skies of occupied Europe. On the afternoon of December 31st, 1943, a lone, severely damaged B-17F Flying Fortress, part of the 533rd Bombardment Squadron, 381st Bomb Group, limped away from the brutal German defenses of Ludwigshafen. Its mission was over. Its bombs were gone. But its most critical fight, the fight for survival, was just beginning. The bomber, named Wolfhound, was coming home with wounds that would have sent a lesser craft plummeting from the sky. And it was coming in with no wheels. To understand the magnitude of the challenge facing Wolfhound and her crew, we must first understand the machine and the men. Commanding Wolfhound on this, its 14th mission, was 22-year-old pilot, First Lieutenant John J. Moran. His co-pilot was Second Lieutenant William Bill Lehman. Alongside them flew a tight-knit crew of 7, the navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator, ball turret gunner, waist gunners, and tail gunner. Each man was a specialist, a cog in a complex flying machine. They had formed the bond that only shared danger can forge. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was a symbol of American industrial might and strategic air power. With its 4 Wright Cyclone engines, 11.50 caliber machine guns, and a capacity for over 2 tons of bombs, it was designed to fight its way into enemy territory and back again. But by late 1943, the air war over Europe had reached a fever pitch of violence. German flak batteries littered the skies with shrapnel, and Luftwaffe fighters grew ever more aggressive. Their target that day was the massive IG Farben chemical plant in Ludwigshafen, a cornerstone of Germany's war production. The mission was, in the grim lexicon of the 8th Air Force, rough. Intense, accurate flak met the formation over the target. As Wolfhound steadied for its bomb run, fate intervened. A mere miss from an 88mm flak shell did not strike the fuselage directly. Instead, it detonated just below the aircraft's belly. The concussion was monstrous. The plane bucked violently. For a moment, control seemed lost. Yet, the engines kept running. The bomb bay doors opened and the payload fell away. Lieutenant Moran wrestled the controls, stabilizing the heavy bomber. Initial checks showed no catastrophic fuel leaks, no fires, and no serious injuries to the crew. It seemed they had been lucky. They turned for home for the sanctuary of RAF Ridgewell in Essex, England. But they had missed a critical damage report. In the chaos, obscured from view in the radio room's underside, the flak blast had shattered the hydraulic lines and severed the cables controlling the B-17's landing gear. The wheels were frozen in their wells. Wolfhound was coming home, but it had no way to touch down. The return flight was a 3-hour exercise in mounting dread. As the white cliffs of Dover emerged from the Channel haze, relief was tempered by procedure. The crew began their pre-landing checks. Pilot to co-pilot, landing gear down. Lieutenant Lehman moved the lever. The familiar hydraulic whine was absent. He cycled it again. Nothing. A manual crank was attempted. It refused to budge. The realization was a cold weight in the stomach of every man on board. The damage from the flak burst was far more severe than they had imagined. By 1500 hours, Wolfhound was circling RAF Ridgewell, a wounded bird unable to land. Fuel gauges, though not critical, began their inevitable descent. On the ground, the control tower had been alerted. Alarm bells rang across the base. Fire trucks, their red paint gleaming in the weak English winter sun, raced to line the main runway. Ambulances followed, a silent and grim procession. Back in the air, Lieutenant Moran faced a series of terrible choices. He could order the crew to bail out over friendly territory, but parachuting from a heavy bomber was dangerous in itself, and it would mean the certain loss of the aircraft. The B-17 was a valued weapon of war, one that had, against all odds, brought them this far. The bond between a pilot and his plane is profound. Abandoning her felt like a betrayal. There was another, far more dangerous option: a belly landing, a wheels-up landing. For a B-17, this was the equivalent of a controlled crash. The potential outcomes were a catalog of horrors. The bomber could cartwheel, its massive wings snapping off, spilling fuel. It could grind along the runway, sending a cascade of sparks into fuel-soaked cavities. Or it could simply disintegrate on impact. The 9 men inside would be at the mercy of buckling metal, fire, and uncontrollable momentum. Moran made his decision. He spoke to his crew over the intercom, his voice calm, deliberate. They would attempt to bring Wolfhound home. They would land on her belly. Preparations began immediately. All loose equipment, from ammunition cans to flak jackets, was jettisoned to reduce fire risk and weight. The crew braced themselves. The ball turret gunner, trapped in his tiny sphere beneath the plane, had to be manually cranked into position and extracted, a harrowing procedure performed while flying over England. The men in the waist put on their parachutes, not to jump, but to use the packs as cushions against the coming impact. They assumed crash positions. Navigator Second Lieutenant Robert Doolittle calculated the best approach, into the wind on the longest runway, with every available emergency resource deployed. Word spread across the base. Ground crews, mechanics, and fellow airmen stopped their work. They stood in silence, watching the Silver Fortress make its slow, agonizing circuits, burning off fuel to minimize the risk of a catastrophic explosion. At 15:27 hours, the final turn was made. Wolfhound aligned with the runway. The 4 engines, miraculously still functioning, throttled back. The usual routine of landing flaps and final checks was replaced with a stark, silent checklist of survival. Lieutenant Moran's hands were steady on the yoke. Co-pilot Lehman monitored the airspeed and descent rate with laser focus. There would be no second chance. Too fast, and they would overshoot the runway and plow into the fields beyond. Too slow, and the left wing could stall, sending them into a fatal roll. The plane had to be set down with near-perfect balance on its vulnerable belly. Inside the fuselage, the crew braced. The radio operator, Tech Sergeant Charles "Chuck" Hildreth, later recalled the sheer, deafening silence. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of held breath, of pounding hearts, of prayers whispered against the drone of the engines. They could see the fire trucks flashing below, tiny toys growing larger, becoming real. The runway stretched out, a concrete ribbon of hope and terror. Cutting engines. Moran's voice was the last thing heard over the intercom. The throttles were pulled to idle. The roaring drone of the cyclones faded to a sputter. In the sudden quiet, the rush of wind over the fuselage became a howl. The ground rushed up. They were committed. The first contact was not a smooth glide, but a violent, screeching marriage of metal and concrete. The sound was apocalyptic, a tearing, grinding, shrieking roar that could be heard across the entire airfield. A fountain of sparks, brilliant and terrifying, erupted from beneath the aircraft, trailing behind it like the tail of a comet. Wolfhound was no longer flying. It was a 10-ton projectile, carving a path of destruction down the runway. The bombardier's plexiglass nose shattered. The ventral ball turret was sheared off instantly. The fuselage shuddered and screamed in protest, the airframe straining against forces it was never designed to withstand. Inside, the men were thrown against their restraints, battered by shock waves that traveled through the deck plating. Everything not bolted down was sent flying. The world dissolved into noise, vibration, and the smell of scorched metal. For 7 endless seconds, the bomber skidded, threatening to veer off the runway or collapse onto a wing at any moment. A fuel tank ruptured, spraying aviation fuel along the scarred path. Yet, miraculously, no fire ignited from the cascade of sparks. Lieutenant Moran and Lehman fought with the controls, using the ailerons and rudder to keep the careening beast as straight as possible, their muscles straining against the chaos. The turning point was not a single act of heroism, but the culmination of discipline, skill, and a profound will to live. As the plane's momentum began to bleed away, its screeching descent lowering in pitch, 2 critical factors emerged from the chaos. First, the decision to jettison all excess weight had prevented a more catastrophic imbalance. The aircraft remained, by some miracle, level. Second, and most crucial, was the pilot's technique. Moran had not simply dropped the plane onto the concrete, he had flown it onto the ground, holding the nose up for as long as possible, allowing the reinforced belly of the bomber, specifically the radio room deck and the midline of the fuselage, to bear the brunt of the initial impact. This prevented the nose or engines from digging in, which would have guaranteed a fatal somersault. Now, as speed dissipated, the massive tail section, with its distinctive dorsal fin, began to settle. With a final groaning shudder of tearing metal, the aircraft slid to a stop. Dust and smoke swirled around the mangled machine. For a moment, there was silence once more, a stunned, heavy silence. Then, the crew sprang into action. There was no celebration, only urgent procedure. The threat of fire was still overwhelming. Fuel vapors hung in the air. "Abandon aircraft! Now! Now! Now!" Hatches were flung open. The crew, shaken but mobile, scrambled out onto the torn wings and onto the scarred runway. They slid to the ground, putting distance between themselves and the potential inferno. The ground emergency teams, who had watched the spectacle in horror, now raced forward, foam trucks at the ready. But no explosion came, no fire took hold. The sparks had danced on fuel-soaked metal and found no purchase. The men gathered, counting heads. 9. All 9 were out. They were bruised, battered, some with cuts and sprains, but they were alive. They stood in a ragged group, watching as the smoke cleared around the shattered form of Wolfhound.
The aircraft that had been their home, their weapon, and their prison was a wreck. Its back was broken, its underside a twisted cavity of ripped metal. But it had saved them. It had held together just long enough.
On the runway, amidst the smell of fuel, scorched aluminum, and adrenaline, Lieutenant John Moran looked at his crew, then at the plane. They had defied the odds. They had taken a set of circumstances designed for tragedy and, through cold nerve and textbook execution, rewritten the ending. The aftermath was one of assessment and awe. The crew of Wolfhound was whisked away for medical checks and the obligatory debriefing. Their injuries were remarkably light. concussions, lacerations, severe bruising. Not a single man required extended hospitalization.
The successful belly landing of Wolfhound was immediately recognized for its extraordinary skill and value. It became a case study in aircrew resilience and piloting under extreme duress. For displaying exceptional leadership, courage, and airmanship, First Lieutenant John J. Moran was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. His citation read, in part, for extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight, and for the superior manner in which he handled a critical situation, bringing his damaged aircraft and entire crew to a safe landing against impossible odds.
His co-pilot, Second Lieutenant William Lehman, and other key crew members received air medals for their roles in the emergency. But the greatest medal, shared by all 9, was their survival.
The aircraft itself was not so fortunate. The damage was deemed beyond economical repair. The fortress that had flown 14 missions against the heart of Nazi Germany was stripped of any usable parts and then unceremoniously scrapped. Its metal likely recycled for the war effort it had served so well. Its story, however, was far from over.
The legacy of Wolfhound is not one of a dramatic aerial duel or a record number of missions. It is a legacy of the cold, hard moments after the battle. It is about the decisions made when the guns are silent, but the danger is more acute than ever. It demonstrated that even in the age of mass industrial warfare, the skill and courage of individual men could snatch life from the jaws of almost certain death. It was a testament to the design of the B-17, the training of the U.S. Army Air Forces, and the unbreakable will of a single crew who refused to give up their ship or each other. The story of Wolfhound is a stark reminder that in war, victory is not only measured in territory taken or enemy planes shot down. It is sometimes measured in inches of clearance, in seconds of control, and in the safe return of 9 men to friendly soil. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to the War Archives as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.